U.S. President Joe Biden became the first sitting president to visit the site in Tulsa in Oklahoma where hundreds of black Americans were massacred by a white mob in 1921. He said the legacy of racist violence still resonates. Welcome to WION World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma and this is our special weekly broadcast of the WION-VOA Co-Production where we look at some of the biggest stories coming from America. Let's begin. U.S. President Joe Biden recently visited the state of Oklahoma this week, becoming the first sitting U.S. president to commemorate the anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, the destruction in 1921 of a prosperous black community by a white mob that left up to 300 people dead. Thousands of survivors had to stay in internment camps for a time, overseen by the National Guard. VOA's White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara has more in this next report. Take a look.
In 1921, Greenwood was a prosperous African-American community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It included a neighborhood known as Black Wall Street. A white mob, assisted by an all-white police department, burned Greenwood to the ground, leaving hundreds of people dead and thousands homeless. A dark chapter in the nation's history that has been largely buried for decades.
Even people that are native to Tulsa didn't know about it until recently.
On Tuesday, President Joe Biden visited the Greenwood Cultural Center. He is the first U.S. president to commemorate the anniversary of the tragic event in Tulsa.
My fellow Americans, this was not a riot. This was a massacre.
He met with 3 survivors of the massacre, all over 100 years old.
You are the 3 known remaining survivors of a story seen in the mirror dimly. But no longer. Now your story will be known in full view.
While the national conversation has increasingly focused on the issue of systemic racism and Black Lives Matter, the Tulsa Massacre was covered up for decades.
Records were actually removed from the City Hall, removed from the library. They deliberately covered up that whole history. And then now you see a continued attempt to, continue to whitewash the history of racism and white supremacy in this country.
In the centuries since the massacre, black Americans continue to be discriminated against. According to government data, the typical white family has 8 times the wealth of the typical black family, a gap that widened further during the pandemic. Biden announced steps to narrow the gap, including plans to invest tens of billions of dollars in disadvantaged communities, expand federal contracting with minority-owned businesses, and repeal 2 Trump-era rules that restrict fair housing practices. But he did not mention reparations, whether for the Tulsa Massacre survivors or for the enslavement of African Americans.
It's hypocritical for us to go out around the world and try to demand other countries treat their citizens right and to be fair and just when America has yet to be just and has yet to atone for her worst race massacre in American history.
Biden's visit came at a time when many conservative states are pushing for new voting laws. Republicans say they want to reduce fraud, but Democrats say their real goal is to make it harder for blacks and other minorities to vote. Biden is appointing Vice President Kamala Harris to lead the administration's efforts on expanding voting rights. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
Reach some consensus on
To speak about this further, we're now joined by Voice of America correspondent Amy Hybels from Washington. Amy, welcome to this special broadcast. Tell us more about this recent decision to have U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris lead this new effort on expanding voting rights. Tell us more.
Well, Vice President Kamala Harris said in a statement she plans to work with voting rights groups, community organizations, and even the private sector to strengthen voting rights. She really wants to push also for federal legislation in this regard. Now, the For the People Act, as it's called, is a bill that both she and President Joe Biden support. If it were to pass, it would call for sweeping changes in U.S. election law. The bill would restrict gerrymandering of congressional districts. That basically means you can't carve out districts of voters that favor one candidate over another. The bill would strike down hurdles to voters, and it would also bring transparency to campaign finance systems. Now, it passed in the U.S. House of Representatives, which meet in the U.S. Capitol building right behind me, and it's expected to be taken up for a vote by the U.S. Senate on June 21st, but it faces a lot of Republican opposition. Remember, the U.S. Senate is evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, and in fact, Republican Senate Senate leader Mitch McConnell has already said that he plans to vote this to block this legislation. He describes it as government overreach in state election systems. Keep in mind, everything that's happening here on Capitol Hill is set against the backdrop of what's happening in state capitals across the country, where Republican lawmakers, experts say, are pushing an unprecedented number of bills that are aimed at restricting access to the ballot box. Now, Republicans say that, hey, this legislation is designed to prevent voter fraud. They're just trying to protect the voting process here in this country. But Democrats really feel that these measures are aimed at undermining the minority vote. As an example, just last week in the U.S. state of Texas, the legislature was pushing voting bills that would have limited or reduced the early voting hours, and it would also tighten the restriction on ID for participating in absentee voting. Well, these were measures that the Republicans were supporting and that the Democrats were very much opposed to. So in an effort to block this move by the State House, the Democrats walked out of the State House on Sunday night. So the Biden administration here in Washington, D.C. is very much aware of what's happening at the state level. That's why they're pushing so hard for federal legislation that they support.
Right, Amy. Now coming to the story that we just heard earlier, the U.S. president did not make any mention of reparations in his prepared remarks in Tulsa. Is this still a very important issue that is being discussed?
Absolutely. This whole issue of reparations for Black Americans whose relatives were enslaved and for other forms of racial discrimination is very much alive and the subject of debate here in the U.S., and it has been for decades. Now, here on Capitol Hill, a House panel back in April approved legislation that would create a committee to study the issue of paying reparations to the descendants of slaves. But there's actually a lot more happening at the local level. Just this week, the state of California decided to create a committee to look into paying reparations. And back in March, the Chicago suburb of Evanston, Illinois, became the first city in the U.S. to decide to pay reparations to the descendants of slaves. Another example right here in Washington, D.C., the prestigious Georgetown University has reparations efforts underway right now. Back in 1838, the school's religious leaders sold 272 slaves, including children, to try to settle the school's debts. So now they've taken this step. So this discussion and action here in the U.S. is still very much alive in regard to this issue.
Right, Amy. Stay with us on this special broadcast. We'll come back to you for another story that's coming from America. Now, Republicans in the U.S. Senate voted last Friday to block a legislation that would create a panel to investigate the deadly January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol, where lawmakers were meeting to certify President Joe Biden's election victory over Donald Trump. VOA's Laurel Bauman has more on this. Take a look.
It was a sight that stunned the nation and the world. Supporters of then-President Donald Trump storming the U.S. Capitol, battling police and overrunning congressional offices, looking for lawmakers and then Vice President Mike Pence. So far, more than 400 people have been charged in the assault that left 5 people dead, including Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, whose mother urged Republican senators to vote for a commission to investigate the day's events.
Just look at the footage of what all these people went through and all these police officers did to make them safe, to keep them safe.
But after a drawn-out voting process on Thursday and Friday, Republicans secured enough votes to defeat a measure, creating a bipartisan panel to investigate what happened.
The Democrats sort of offered Republicans a chance to participate or to have some larger role in this commission over the January 6th events. But even though this bill got Republican votes in the U.S. House, it doesn't seem like the U.S. Senate Republicans are going to want to vote for this thing.
Republican Senator Mitch McConnell said he did not believe the commission would uncover anything of significance.
I do not believe the additional extraneous commission that Democratic leaders want would uncover crucial new facts or promote healing. Frankly, I do not believe it is even designed to do that.
Regardless of the Senate vote, Democrats can hold their own hearings, but that would be a departure from past commissions.
The 9/11 Commission had bipartisan buy-in, even if both sides weren't equally enthusiastic. Even the impeachment of Richard Nixon, going back to the early 1970s, was done in a bipartisan fashion. The investigation in the Senate and ultimately the hearings leading up to articles of impeachment in the House of Representatives. Almost always when we've had a crisis before, even one that had strong partisan elements, we've seen strong bipartisanship. Not now.
Analysts say with 2022 midterm elections taking shape, Republicans want voters focused on President Joe Biden and not on former President Donald Trump.
Republicans want to forget what happened on January 6th, and they want the country to have a case of collective amnesia.
Election politics always play a role in congressional votes, but analysts worry that the failure to investigate the attack on the Capitol is a worrying sign for the country's deeply polarized politics. Laurel Bowman, VOA News, Washington.
For more updates on this story, we still have Voice of America's Amy Hybels with us on this broadcast. Amy, now following last week's vote, will any steps be taken on Capitol Hill to take a closer look at what happened back on January 6th?
Well, this really was their one shot at creating a bipartisan commission to look into this issue. Now, Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has come up with several options, according to the Associated Press. Those include calling for another vote in the U.S. Senate on this issue, or perhaps having the U.S. House of Representatives investigate the matter. But then that would be looked at as being partisan because the U.S. House of Representatives is controlled by the Democrats. Now, next week, 2 Senate committees, which are bipartisan, plan to release recommendations in a report, that according to CNN. However, this report is really focused on security failures on January 6th. It doesn't look at all into the role that former President Donald Trump played in the lead up to the attack on the U.S. Capitol that day.
Right. My final question for you, Amy. While the effort in the U.S. Congress to create a bipartisan commission failed, what can you tell us about the separate criminal investigation that's unfolding?
Sure. Well, the FBI, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is the federal agency that's charged with leading the criminal investigation into the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Now, so far, more than 36 members and associates of the far-right groups, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, have been charged with crimes. And one Oath Keeper has actually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. But they make up just a small fraction of the more than 400 people that have been charged with crimes so far in this matter. Now, the reason prosecutors decided to narrow in on those 2 extremist groups is they were trying to figure out how much planning went into the events that we all saw unfold on January 6th. But authorities say they are intent on arresting anyone that was involved in the rioting.
Right, Amy, thank you so much for joining us on WION, and thank you for all your inputs and insights. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.